Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Riley Miller, and I'm the Senior Analyst for the New Lines Institute Strategy and Policy and the author of the Wagner Report, the Wagner Group Future of Russian Policy Now, which we're excited to be releasing a print today. I'm joined by two esteemed panelists, Maximilian Hess, one risk analyst, as well as a fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Max recently published his debut book, Economic Wars, Ukraine and the Global Conflict between Russia and the West, where he outlines the Russian war in Ukraine and how it has created international economic conflict affecting us. In addition to Max, we're joined by John Lyncher, a journalist who has spent a significant amount of time in the Central African Republic covering issues related to language, history, culture, politics, and of course, Wagner. On behalf of the New Lines Institute, it's my pleasure to introduce this timely discussion on the future of Wagner in Africa. If it's your first time joining New Lines, welcome. We're very excited to have you here. The New Lines Institute was founded in 2019 with a vision for enhancing U.S. foreign policy based on a deep understanding of the vision of geopolitics in different regions and their clouds. We strive to help policymakers in Washington understand both the constraints they face and the opportunities to promote capacity building, peace, and sustainability. For that reason, we're very excited to be hosting this event today. We hope that this discussion will provide new insights on how Wagner operates in the continent and how the recent events, such as the attempted insurrection in June and the deadly plane crash in August that Wagner leadership, will impact the operations on the continent and what role Washington can play in mitigating this line of events. The African continent, as we all know, is faced with compounding crises such as climate change, political and military coups, supply chain disruptions, poverty, and extremism. All crises that Wagner attempts to problem. With the continent growing exponentially and becoming more and more geopolitically relevant, it is time for the United States and Western allies to rethink how we combat this line of events. And with that, I want to turn over to our wonderful moderator, Carolyn, to start us off. Thank you so much for joining us for the panel today. My name is Carolyn Mormon. I'll be moderating this discussion on the future of Wagner in Africa. Just a reminder to our panelists, we're trying to be keeping responses about 2 or 3 minutes, so that would be about 15 minutes at the end. Starting off with the issue that's on everyone's mind, which is the insurrection in late June and the death of Wagner leader Yevgeny Prigozhin. I'm wondering if our panelists can go into how their perceptions about how Wagner's structure and their activities in Africa would be affected by this insurrection in June and the presumed death of Prigozhin, and if kind of this period in between these 2 incidents, how their perceptions changed about it. And we'll start with Riley, and then we'll go to John and Max. So, thank you, Carolyn. Generally speaking, I don't think we're going to be too affected. The structure of Wagner is widely decentralized. In Africa, there's no concrete playbook that is broadly brushed across the continent, making it very easy for Wagner to be adaptive and more resilient to change. Wagner is profit-driven, and they're very profitable in Africa. The New York Times last year suggested that their bringing in is up to $1 billion a year from their operations. Now, given that, I think that they're going to count on this and keep their operations running. John, anything you'd like to add?
Sure. I mean, I think, I agree that overall, the structures, a lot of what changes that are going to occur will be at a level that, in general, we don't usually see. So, in a way, it's difficult to say what's going to change because there's a lot that we still don't know. But I think, in general, it's safe to assume that the curatorship overall will probably pass to some figures within the Ministry of Defense. What that means on the ground could be very little. The same personalities that were running operations in CAR in Mali are still there. There's still an interest in running those operations. I'm usually a little bit more skeptical about how much Wagner is in Saharan Africa. But if we look at one of the places where we might actually see some more significant change, it would be in Syria, and this is because the Ministry of Defense has presence there, obviously.
Anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think that one of the successes that Prigozhin had was that he was very effectively playing the entrepreneurial game within the Russian elite that Putin has historically allowed various factions of the security services and members of his inner circle going back to the 1990s, including those who were from economic backgrounds, not security service backgrounds, to compete. The transition that we are seeing, it appears to have begun already before Putin's apparent untimely demise. We saw, for example, the Russian Deputy Minister of Defense, Yevgeny Prigozhin, head of Ingushetia, Russian region of Caucasus, Libya, just before. And I thought that one of the interesting questions is, it seems likely that things will come under the Ministry of Defense, but as John mentioned, a number of these personalities are already there. Some of them have formally signed up to other private military companies, some of which have closer ties to the Ministry of Defense. And historically, this sort of entrepreneurial game that Putin has allowed members of his selected elite to play with one another has occasionally resulted in conflict between them. This happens in Africa is certainly something that remains to be seen. I am of the position as well that even $1 billion in profits, which I think is probably somewhere near accurate or not a bad ballpark estimate, is, even by sanctioned Russian standards, not a giant amount. But one of the questions is Wagner, of course, is getting lots of money directly from the Kremlin in Russia to basically be the ministry of uncouth and unpleasant things that other people didn't want to touch. So, that money will probably go to someone else. How rapacious a particular individual is there. And of course, there are many areas just adjacent in Africa where Wagner could take an even greater role in the future, and that could have further both economic and geopolitical implications. The interesting countries that's also had a coup in West Africa in recent years that I don't think gets a lot of attention is Guinea, which of course is the world's third largest bauxite supplier, key in aluminum production around the world, and also an environment in which we'd be interested, but also where the questions of China. So we have all these moving parts, and I don't think we can say we know yet, but I would say we can't rule out the potential that entrepreneurial competition does lead to new developments we haven't seen.
Absolutely. And I'd like to turn now to different ways that Wagner is active. As the report states, Wagner is operating in multiple countries in Africa, but I'd like to pick out some of the case studies Africa and tell us about certain countries in particular. So starting with Max, we've done a lot of work on Sudan. How has the Wagner Group and Russia utilized the continuing conflict we've seen between Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces since April to achieve broader Russian foreign policy?
I think that this is actually primarily an example of where the Kremlin is reactionary, which is typically my view of its position in most places in the world outside of Eurasia, including Africa, including Mediterranean, Syria. Wagner appears to be supplying and already had a key established relationship with the RSF. There have been certainly claims that they are directly supplying them with drones and other equipment. Wagner's real interest there is, however, around its gold mines. And those are potentially more profitable than certainly any of its operations in Kara. None of that money under Prigozhin, historically, as far as we can best tell, actually went to Russia. It went to most likely Dubai to be smelted and shipped around the world, and the money was probably polluted. I think that if Wagner is making the right, and I simply don't have enough understanding of its news dynamics to say that it is, but then certainly their demand will be, I think, more assets. And even if Sudan goes the other way, the Sudanese military itself, despite Burhan, its head having recently had some, meetings with Western leaders and trying to present himself as the better guy. Both sides have competing narratives there, and either way, without a more coordinated and active Sudan policy, particularly from the United States, but also from Europe, Wagner and Russia's ability to sort of act in a reactionary manner mean that they could potentially gain benefits geopolitically and economically from both sides, despite the current parallel
So you mentioned Bold and recently released book, Economic Trade and the Global Conflict between Russia and the West. You allude to this connection between Wagner's activities in Africa, particularly in regard to gold and Russian efforts to undercut Western-dominated financial. Can you go into where this knowledge comes from?
Sure. So Russia has people currency and thing in the future. There are people here in Kingdom or other places who also are sort of fascinated by the idea. One lasted 339 days as chancellor last year, so but despite I think her being complicit in war crimes, the Russian central bank head Nabiullina is a classically well-trained Keynesian economist who doesn't believe any of this nonsense. But there are voices in Russia who do believe that they should move to a gold-backed system, and this would be a way to try to mitigate sanctions. The Kremlin did have this fortress balance sheet strategy that it built up before the war in Ukraine, in which it tried to move some assets away from dollars, but really built up a large amount of savings, about half of which was taken out on the 27th of February last year through sanctions. So it didn't prove that effective. But the point that I'm always keen to make is even within the Kremlin system, within that competition, those sort of gold bugs, Sammy Vaziev's a prominent one, who had wanted Nabiullina's position or wanted her pushed out, would publicly criticize her in the Duma for not doing more with gold, while at the same time none of the gold that Wagner was taking out of Sudan was actually ending up back in Russia. So I think it's sort of evidence of that failure to join up policy, but at the same time, sometimes they do come together and join up. Prigozhin's work with other members of the Russian security elite in Africa before, not necessarily always successfully, but how Wagner is able to do so in the future gets back to our initial points. We have more questions than answers to this.
Absolutely. And now I'd like to turn to West Africa, which of course has been on the news a lot lately, as this summer Niger was the third country in the Sahel, after Mali with Burkina Faso to fall to a coup, while of course the Sahel is a very large and rapidly expanding jihadist insurgency. So turning to you, Riley, drawing on how the group operates, how Wagner Group operates, and causes instability in Mali, what elements of Wagner's involvement in this country are you worried of spreading to Burkina Faso and now Niger? Because there are rumors that Wagner operating in the Sahel.
Thank you, Carolyn. I think one thing that we need to understand here first is what is Wagner doing in Mali. So Wagner's in Mali for mainly. However, they operate with very minimal oversight, and as such are kind of wreaking havoc and causing a lot of chaos, massacres. International Human Rights Watch recently, I think it was about 3 weeks ago, there was reports that they were involved with a Malalian government support unit that killed 500 people, civilians and children, in the Gao region. So it's obviously very concerning. The violence is very concerning. Watch out for disinformation. One thing that Wagner is very prominent at is conducting disinformation campaigns and destabilizing regimes politically at the local level and at the so with anti-Western support increasing constantly throughout the region, and with the withdrawal of the French and now the UN in Mali, and with the most recent visits from the former defense minister and one of his top generals to the region, I think it's incredibly likely that they're going to be reasserting their dominance and value of Russian support in that region as well.
Absolutely. And last but not least, we're going to turn to Libya, to John. I have been in studies attempting to show the different range of activities Wagner's involved in the countries in Africa. And so, John, how do Wagner's activities in Libya what the panelists? How did Wagner's meddling countries support larger Russian?
Sure. I think we also just need to also take a step back and think about, when we're describing these activities. I think Libya is an excellent example of the power and the role that the African governments actually have, and how Wagner is also a tool of African governments to achieve their own domestic policies. I have a hard time believing that Wagner's targeting and massacres of ethnic or Fulani is not something that the Malian government doesn't agree with. I think that these guys are used specifically as a tool of violence to do the dirty work, when at the same time they know that at the end of the day, if they can distance from Wagner, probably go back into the West and say, oh, that was a big mistake. What can you give us in terms of concessions on our own kind of elections, pushing things down. So Wagner is a very useful tool for African governments who want to, enhance their own domestic position. In Libya too, I think it shows the degree to which the most powerful people are the people on the ground, the Libyans themselves. At the end of the day, Haftar has done an excellent job of balancing Western diplomats and the Russians. We saw it most recently, where he met with leaders in Africa and then went to Moscow, I think, about 2 days later. But Haftar essentially was able to bring Wagner in as a force multiplier when he was attacking in his offensive on Tripoli. Ultimately, the only thing that prevented Wagner and the LNA from taking Tripoli was the Turks intervening with their own force of about 10,000 mercenaries. And so we essentially had a situation where Syrians were fighting Syrians in Tripoli from each side. From there, Wagner has largely just had a presence on base in the country. They have been rumored to be involved in fuel smuggling and these types of activities. But again, it's always with the invitation and the complicity, the complicitness of the Haftar regime as well. These guys partner at the end of it. And it wouldn't be happening if the local regimes were not benefiting monetarily.
And well, those familiar with Wagner, I'm sure our audience is very aware that the car is also a area that's very active. And so now we're going to turn towards that. In the report, Riley did a great job of talking about how Wagner's counterterror missions in countries like ours have led to human rights abuses, such as, for example, the alleged January 22 massacre in Riyadh, which is Central Park. Riley, I'm wondering, in your research, what other ramifications do things like this have on society, specifically in Central African Republic and the country's continued conflict today?
Yeah, thanks, Carolyn. So I think understanding the cycle is important. As we discussed earlier, there's no system that Wagner uses, so they kind of go in and seamlessly create these methods that keep themselves employed. And we outline this kind of cycle of abuse. So essentially, I broke it down into 7 steps that are simple. The first step is kind of offering contracted security services. The second step is successfully completing those services. And then they are gaining operational autonomy, lack of oversight, in which they're able to expand their operations. Foreign specifically is interesting because for these security operations, despite the reported human rights abuses, have been able to obtain very lucrative mining contracts that are sustainably funding their operations. So this creates cycles of dependency on Wagner by the government as these groups join and get larger because of the abuse facing, and it creates this ultimately harms society, it harms economic growth.
And now that we're on car, John, you spent a lot of time on the ground and detailed in your many work and your many writings on it. And so Riley brought up this cycle of abuse. And you mentioned earlier how governments to do the dirty work they wanted to for their benefit. I'm wondering if you could talk about that, specifically in the case of harm and why it's
Well, I think I mean, there are a couple of things that come into play. I mean, it's both with the complicity, but it's also a function of the government's capacity. And Wagner is increasing the government's capacity to retake territory, both in Mali and in some operations, and in CAR as well. At the end of the day, Wagner hasn't changed the overall structure of CAR governance, or the relationship between Central African elites and outside powers. There's always been a comfort since colonial times to outsourcing security to those who are willing to provide it. One issue that I think folks have to come to terms with when it comes to the Central African Republic, if you're going to understand why Wagner is popular is that Wagner's methods have brought a degree of stability to a large part of places that have come under control. That has come with violence, but also we have to understand that violence is the purpose. And that for a lot of people who have lived through a couple of decades now of precarity and violence, who have seen UN interventions that have only kind of got more armed groups, they see that violence as toughness, being tough on the armed. And the armed groups are also highly violent and commit atrocities. And so for people who are in these areas, they recognize obviously the negative externalities. But at the same time, they think that, well, at least now I can go, to the next town and without being worried about getting. Obviously, over time, those judgments they shift because as you get more security, then you want other things. But we have to realize that the poorest place in the world, hierarchy is pretty narrow. And Wagner is providing a degree of stability at a cost that for a lot of people it is worth.
And I'd like to now move towards the recommendation section of this panel where we discuss motives for the U.S. government and other legislators throughout the world to deal with Wagner's atrocities and Wagner's. Before we head there, I'd like to bring up FUNAC, which is current legislation in the House and Senate, bipartisan in nature, that basically will force the Biden administration to label Wagner as a terrorist. All of the ramifications that come with that. And as of recently, the bill has made it through the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and headed to the floor after budget situation, everyone is aware. And the UK recently has also labeled Wagner as a so I'm wondering if I can ask each of our panel and start with Bradley and John, what implications do you think a designation like this, if it is passed, will have on U.S. foreign policy, on Wagner operations in Africa, and also this larger U.S. outlet?
I think the designation allows firstly a broadening scope of sanctions against regimes that cooperate with it, something that I would hesitate very much towards because while sanctions are very effective as a tool, war by other means for limiting the Russian state capacity, they're very ineffective as a tool for convincing governments not to do something. The second is, of course, that it set the stage for certain limited interventions against the group. Again, another area where I would really caution action. I think the sort of best success story that we have in the West for getting Wagner out of the country is in Mozambique. They were only there very briefly together with the state, trying to get an interest in Mozambique's burgeoning gas industry. Hadn't started yet, just started last year, production. But largest new gas producer in Africa. It's a very important commodity in the years moving forward. This was seen in the last year alone. And there was really allowing Wagner's sort of own worst elements to take it down, as well as quietly helping provide funding for other alternative private security providers, some of whom have terrible track records. They're not individuals I would want to share a meal, but certainly who help protect the facilities there from a small growing, but at the time growing Islamist insurgent movement, understanding that was the government's priority was something that the West probably didn't let get in the way, despite having a big dispute with Mozambique over fraud in the capital markets. So, I'm not sure that this is the immediate best response. Great, let us do airstrikes. I don't know, maybe I don't think that the solution to every problem is a hammer. Sometimes you do have to make difficult decisions. This is rhetorically the right step, yes. labeling as part of the Russian state officially would have much graver security implications, but I worry that it will lead to this very slow, heavy wise, kind of foolish policies.
Right?
Yeah, I echo that sentiment. I think it's important to note that Wagner is a regulated foreign criminal organization in the United States, and that's something that we should be capitalizing on and improving our policy about Wagner. I think as the Farm Act is currently written, it's a little confusing to be quite frank. There's an exception policy where the Biden administration can choose to basically give an exception for a country to continue operating with Wagner and avoid sanctions. Additionally to that, it required African countries to cut ties with Wagner after a year. As we kind of laid out in this panel, they don't have the capacity necessarily to do that, and there's no one footing that bill either. So if we're going to label Wagner a foreign terrorist organization, which by definition of a terrorist organization, I think they do qualify for, we have to put in backstops to prevent power vacuums that will then just be filled by Russia. So yes, but no is my answer on the Farm Act. I think it's understood why the UK and EU are moving toward that designation and why we would also want to move toward that designation. However, if we aren't ready to kind of fill the gaps that have been left by the French and the EU in places like South Africa and Mali, then China and Russia will. And I think we need to be aware of that.
John, would you like to add anything?
I mean, I think it's a terrible idea. I think you could just throw your policy up. Because, I mean, the way that the Wagner is coming about in an interesting time as we're kind of slowly heading towards multipolarity and the ability of other countries to provide security in Africa. And if you think about the structure of the system right now, if for whatever reason, it doesn't matter, democratic, non-democratic, an African government is not happy with it's Western intervention or a UN intervention, who else can they go to? There's only one other gig in town. And how, that gig is absolutely imperfect, but if you call that other option a terrorist organization, there's no way it's not going to be perceived as just a neo-colonial step to try and keep the West in Africa. It plays into every single narrative that Wagner itself is looking to put out there. So I think at the end of the day, you kind of have to put up or shut up. You have to offer alternatives that you think are better than Wagner, and not just these kind of rhetorical condemnations and calling them a terrorist organization. As we talked about earlier, that doesn't solve these problems. Mercenaries are a product of conflict. They don't create conflict. Always in a conflictual environment.
So now that I think I can speak for all the panelists that we're not a fan of the Farm Act, and with that, we've outlined the problem in the past half an hour that Wagner is causing, but also the problems that they're, in their own way, attempting to solve for whatever rationale. How does the U.S. government and other partners move against the Wagner Group? How do we remove them from these countries, but as the panelists have outlined, not create a power vacuum in their exit and not damage U.S. African? We'll again start with Max and Riley and then.
I think this is probably a point that I'm keen to make on general anti-Russian influence policy, particularly economically, is my area of focus, but security matters in Africa in particular as well, which is that we really like to use sticks, but we really don't have a very good policy of offering carrots. And whether that be through security provisions, whether that be through economic assistance, whether that be those are really the two ways that I see doing it. And a lot of these countries, for example, complain about the legacy of CFA franc. I actually have big thoughts that CFA franc in a good economy with capital flowing can be a very good boon for investment. But the nominal fact that some of it is held within the French Treasury, it makes it easy to go after. And just taking on their criticisms and restructuring our own institutions and support in line with those criticisms, I think is something that is decades overdue. Certainly the best time to start is always now, if there isn't an option. And then also to find ways to offer care and support there. I mean, again, I go back to Mozambique, this story, despite a frankly quite absurd scandal called the tuna bond story, where much money was stolen with the complicity of Western banks. From the country, investment support in the IMF came back into Mozambique around the time that Cape Wagner security forces came in. So for me, it's about carrots, not sticks.
Yeah, I echo that sentiment. I think that was about building up the resources that Africa has. But on top of that, I think we really need to start going after the financial aspects of Wagner. A significant portion of Wagner's funds are made up of United Arab Emirates, and we've turned a blind eye to it. And I think that that's something that the United States could take additional pursuits with. Additionally, I recommended rebuilding the American Racketeering Act and organization. We had quite a bit of success with this with the 2015 FIFA case, as I'm sure we all remember. So I think tackling it from both the financial aspect, but also at the same time, building up the capacity, building up the institutions, supporting ECOWAS, providing them with legitimacy as they're struggling with currently, building up the African Union, partnering, giving them opportunities to expand and grow themselves without coming in with a stick and saying, we can't do it that way. I think another opportunity would be for the AFRICOM to expand their mass atrocities training to the African Union and to ECOWAS as well, as they start tackling both mass atrocities in the Sahel, but also the Central African Republic. Adding, it's all about capacity building. If we're going to pull out and expect these countries to stand on their own and not rely on mercenary support, we have to give them the capacity to do so. On the flip side of that, as I briefly mentioned earlier, tackling the financial aspect of it, starting to really go after the assets here, both in Western Europe, the United Arab Emirates, and parts of the United States will be essential.
John?
I don't want to sugarcoat it. To be honest, I don't think that there's much that people can do. Wagner is a phenomenon, right? It's come out of a specific time in Russia, a specific type of governance, and is also absolutely part of overall trends in the privatization of warfare. And part of globalization that we see is that it's easier and easier now to move men with experience in war to new places. The UAE can ship thousands of people to Yemen. Wagner in Turkey shipped thousands of people from Syria to Libya. And what you have in Russia is a similar pool now, and it's only growing of men who have military experience and are going to look to find ways to find employment. So I think we're heading for an interesting time where we're only going to see more of this, not necessarily always Wagner, and we're going to have to rethink definitions as well, and how we define the problem, what the problem actually is. But I think it's too early to think about how to go about countering it, because there's really no good ways to go about it.
Well, with that very sobering discussion, we have about 20 minutes for Q&A. If you would please stand up, if you'd like, and announce your name and your affiliation, and you ask a question that ends in a question to our panelists. That would be great. Thank you. Gentlemen in front.
Jesse Marks, Refugees International. So we're, as an institution, we were engaged very heavily on a number of these specific questions that are linked to background migrations, at least whether they play a supporting role or major role. One of the challenges that we come back to is that governments lack capacity, or in many cases, some of which are engaged in, some of which are not. With the shift and with the juntas in the region, how is this Wagner 2.0 being perceived by both the juntas but the existing governments in the region? Are we seeing a split in those relationships? Like, are we expecting more coups to occur? We've had a domino effect to some extent. just from a kind of humanitarian side, potential implications and ability to predict behavior response.
Absolutely. Riley and then John, whoever would like to.
I think the note about displacement is interesting because it creates kind of a metastasizing conflict, right? Where people are moving because of Wagner, and they're also moving to countries that can't handle them, which is causing them to deploy Wagner and so forth. It's a mess. I'm not going to lie there. I think it's really complex. I don't think it's anything that we're going to show solve. Right. To answer the second part of your question, are we expecting more coups and more splits? I think Wagner's kind of been stabilizing. I wouldn't be surprised if we see more of it. But coups are not that uncommon, especially in Scotland. In the last 3 years, we've seen 9. So yes and no, I think is the answer to that. And I've said that a few times today, but I think that they will encourage and support decent governments, as we've seen the defense minister was actively supporting the Nigerian they support Mali and they've supported us on the border as well. So yes, it's possible there will be more support, but I also don't think that it's necessarily applied for this. I think that's much more fundamental.
Yeah, I mean, I think Wagner is, I mean, like we were talking about, or I was saying earlier, we're in a very binary system in Africa right now, where you either have a Western intervention or you have a Russian intervention. I think for a lot of the governments in the Sahel, like in Burkina, we've actually seen something very interesting, which again points to the agency of local governments. Wagner doesn't just fill into a vacuous space. They have to be invited by the government. They haven't engaged in any coups themselves. They ultimately, it has to work on a state-by-state basis. And for countries like Burkina, where sovereignty, I mean, it's a country of Sankara, I mean, sovereignty is a big issue and it cuts both ways with any partner. And so they've seen some of the economic penetration in CAR, and they've actually held Wagner at bay, trying to get very close to the Russian government while absolutely avoiding the Wagner option. As your political position narrows, which it probably is for Traore at this point, they're in a conflict. You're just looking to live to the next day politically, and so they're going to go with the option that lets them live to the next day, no matter how palatable it is at the end. And the anti-French sentiment is something that's very genuine among urban youth in the Sahel. It's something that we have to take seriously because it's something that can be both beneficial for political legitimacy of a government, but it also cuts both ways too. And it narrows your ability to work with other partners. France can't be invited back in. France was the only other actor who really had an interest in being there. So, at the end of the day, I wouldn't be surprised to see Russia because there's no other option.
Max?
Yeah, I certainly am of the opinion that there are that there is a risk of. The reality is we can't be active and taking interest everywhere, and certainly that's as much as I in some cases would like more activity and for instance domestic political realities we have in the United States and in Europe and can't ignore those. In terms of sort of efforts and where I think things can go, what I would say is, I mentioned earlier I spoke about carrots, and one of the key factors, of course, is that a instability all around the world tends to increase when food prices spike and there's higher inflation. I have no doubt and think that there are very few people outside of the halls of the Kremlin who would disagree that right now one of the biggest threats to food prices around the world is Russia's actions in the Black Sea. It's well and good to try to go around and tell everybody in sub-Saharan Africa or elsewhere that the Kremlin is responsible for this. That's not enough to alleviate the problem. And that's why Putin, can meet with Kais Saied, the Tunisian president, for example, the other day, and offer him free grain, and Saied will say nice things about the history of Russian-Tunisian relations that aren't actually necessarily true. But that's because the IMF and Western institutions have higher bars for moves that he doesn't want to take to get it. So he may, he's not an unintelligent individual. I'm sure he's aware that Russia's responsible for that grain price increase, but just that's the reality of it. We do have voices within Africa who've been very good about this. The Ghanaian president, Bukoado, at the United Nations last year, made it very clear that every bomb the Russians throw at Ukraine directly affects Africa because of the impact on the food price. At the same time, there's been some help for Ghana in dealing with its debt restructuring. Over the last year, China's been sort of the main blockage point, but there's been no effort to try to help them alleviate their own food crisis. I won't claim enough insight to know, and of course that's a country with a history of many coups and much instability. The just sort of saying and explaining things isn't enough. We need to go in and say, whether it's through financing for domestic programs, a lot of Western African countries have their cocoa, bean and cocoa boards, one of the few commodities where there hasn't been as major inflation of late. The prices are actually down, so again, purchasing power. We need to find ways to help them produce their own food, certainly, and to support them on the global market in dealing with that. Just having them acknowledge and know and explain that it's the Russian responsibility isn't enough of a solution. And while I don't think it's been hugely successful yet, Putin is the only one going there and saying how to be. So if you're in a country somewhere else dealing with the food crisis and instability, it's the only game in town.
We can take another question.
Hi, I'm esteemed state. So we've talked a lot about how Russia's foreign policy tool in Africa is Wagner and all these things that Russia is getting out of their deployments across Africa. But can you also talk about how it's a lodestone that, in these countries, these specific countries we've been talking about, it's a major force and more positive relationship with the leadership of those countries. But you've also mentioned the atrocities that have been perpetuated. How has that impacted Russia's stature negatively? Both in those countries where they're not part of the elite, does not necessarily represent all of the people in the country, and also countries like Ghana, where you mentioned where the head of the country is much more aggressively anti-Russian. Other places like Angola, which really shifted their position. You talk about the negative Russia.
I think we'll start with Max this time.
John may have a lot more insights from on the ground that I think should be prioritized. What I would say is the tragic reality is that agency doesn't buy in most of these places. Buy. It doesn't matter. I mean, look at the situation in Darfur, in Sudan right now. Atrocities have begun again, carried out by the Assad, which support. As unpopular as that may make Wagner there, myself, I would certainly assume among certain groups, the reality that those groups will have a political agency to change anything in their own region, let alone in Khartoum, is sadly very, very low. So it is ensuring hearts and minds aren't won by Wagner is certainly important, but the idea that just winning over hearts and minds amongst wide swathes of the population in non-democratic countries that have very weak institutions is sadly